Hello, and welcome to Books in the World. I'm your host, Hugh Blair-Smith. Books in the World is an interview show produced by the Cape Cod Writers Center and the Cape Media Center. The Writers Center was established over 6 decades ago and sponsors a 4-day writers' conference every summer on Cape Cod. The goal of Books in the World is to show how writers, illustrators, publishers, editors, and others in the literary field play their roles in the world of books and other communication media. This show has been broadcast continuously since 1978, making it the longest-running program of its kind in the United States. Today, we are delighted to welcome Richard Maurer, author of The Woman in the Moon. So, Richard, first things first. Who is the Woman in the Moon?
The Woman in the Moon is Margaret Hamilton, not the Margaret Hamilton who was the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, but Margaret Hayfield Hamilton, who was a software engineer playing a leading role in writing the software that guided astronauts from Earth to the moon, down to a landing on the moon, and then back to Earth. It was a remarkable achievement, and she played a key role. And in fact, she was one of very few women who had responsible roles in the Apollo project.
And so my answer to the same question is that Margaret Hamilton is very much a favorite colleague of mine at the MIT Instrumentation Lab. I arrived about 5 to 5.5 years before she did, so I was involved in designing both the hardware and some of the software of the Apollo guidance computer, but it was very much a beginning, and her arrival coincided with the fact that, okay folks, it's time to get serious and really get systematic about producing the program for the control computer. I say she's very much a favorite colleague, and I thought of a way to describe that, which is that in a meeting with Margaret, it was all business, but a small corner of my mind was saying to itself, I'm glad I'm in this room with Margaret. It's not a romantic statement, just an occasion of happiness.
Yeah, she's a remarkable person. Even though I live in central Massachusetts, a mere 50 miles from Cambridge, where she still lives, we never actually met while I was working on the book. I wanted to meet, but she was content to do all of the interviews on the phone. And these interviews went on for over 30 hours altogether. I love talking to her. She's just a wonderful person.
Yeah. Just a very positive presence. And I know that you use the word charm in referring to her as well, you might. On the other hand, there's many kinds of charm. Some is sort of good charm and some is not so good charm. But Margaret's is natural, it's authentic, it's honest, it's the real thing.
Oh yeah, she's a very genuine person. She's from the Midwest originally. She grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. Her family, both of her grandfathers were ministers. She grew up in a little town where her mother taught home ec at the high school, and her dad was an English and philosophy professor at the Minnesota College for Mining and Engineering, I think it's called. So she had this small town Midwestern life, and I mean that still affects her personality. I mean, she's never really gotten that out of her system, and I mean that in a good way.
Of course you do. And one thing I'm certainly very interested in is the fact that you've gone to some work to show what influences worked on her, how she grew into what she became, and all that sort of thing. Especially, I think, in growing up in the Upper Peninsula, she was given enormous amounts of personal freedom.
Yeah.
And she was given the respect of being treated as an equal by her parents.
Yeah. Her whole childhood fascinated me, and we spent quite a lot of time talking about it, and she loved talking about it. And I could relate to it because I myself grew up in a little town out in the middle of nowhere. I grew up in West Texas. But I think small towns, particularly in the United States, small towns in America are all the same. And back then, they were a lot more isolated than they are now, because, you know, there were no, I think in the Upper Peninsula in 1950, when she was a teenager, there were no television stations. There were very few radio stations. There were no major universities. There were few libraries. Of course, there was no internet. You really had to make your entertainment on your own. And I like to say that when you grow up in a boring place, you learn never to be bored. And so she has that self-reliance and resilience that you develop in a place like that.
Yeah. Let's shift gears a little bit now, if we may, and talk about genre. You wrote and marketed this book as a YA, or young adult, book, which suggests that the protagonist is a YA facing YA problems, and certainly there's a good part of the book in which that is exactly accurate, Margaret as a young adult. But of course, a lot of the book is also about her adult life, her not so young adult life. So how did you go about the process of choosing YA as your genre?
I didn't choose YA. YA chose me. And that goes back to my very first book, which was published in 1985. And that was on, it's called The Nova Space Explorer's Guide, Where to Go and What to See. So it's a tie-in with the Nova Science TV show on PBS. It was, they asked me to write it because I had become a specialist on the space photography, the photography made during all the space missions that NASA had done up until that point. And so I could put together a picture book that was very exciting. And then, it was the first book I did, I also wove a narrative through it, a kind of story that took you from Earth and then into Earth orbit on rockets, and then out to the moon, and then to the planets beyond. At the end, you look out to the rest of the universe, to all the galaxies and black holes and whatnot. And that was a YA book. So my first book was a YA book, and they just kept asking me to write YA books thereafter, typically on scientific subjects.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that I was fascinated by the fact that I was unaware of this. I got your book and read it, and it wasn't until after I read the book that I realized it was addressed to the YA audience. Now, when I reread it in preparation for today's operations, I realized, oh, now I see. He's telling people about the Cold War, telling people who are not old enough to remember anything about the Cold War.
Yeah.
And so many other things. So you're helping a lot, and yet in no way does the YA quality interfere with this as an adult book.
Well, thank you. Yeah, I try to write it so that I'm not talking down to the reader. And then, as you say, I can't assume that they know what the Great Depression was, or they know what the Cold War was, or even even that they know what World War II was. And these all play a kind of background role in this particular book. And when I get to that, I try to explain it in an interesting way. So, for example, the Cold War really got going in earnest when Margaret was in college. She went to Earlham College in Indiana. And as luck would have it, there was an English professor at Earlham who he was obsessed with the Soviet threat, and he wrote nationally published articles about this and became quite prominent. So I could use him, this professor on her campus.
Yeah.
as a entry into the whole subject of the Cold War.
Yeah.
And the Cold War figures because that's when the Soviets launched Sputnik, and that launched the whole space race that culminated in the Apollo program.
Yeah. Okay, I just want to maybe get back a little bit to the sequence, her growing up period. I just was making one-word summaries of some of your chapters. One is her relationship with her father, which is absolute solid gold, and I do think that one of the best things about that happens in family life is a really good father-daughter relationship.
Yeah, it was clear from my very first conversation with Margaret that her father played an important role in her life, and I mean, as our fathers do. But if you look at the website for her company, she has a small consulting company for computer software. She has a link to a chapbook of her father's poems, and she has a link to an article published in the Detroit News back in the 1960s about her father's career as a poet. He was a professor poet, and I remember thinking when I saw this is remarkable, because you don't find links like this on websites for software consulting companies.
Right.
So clearly her father, and incidentally the chapbook was dedicated to Margaret. So she told many stories about her father. Her father had a habit of treating her like an adult, even when she was a young child, and they would have these philosophical conversations that I think drove her mother a little crazy, because her mother was very practical minded. And it wasn't just her father. Her grandfather, her mother's father, was a Quaker minister, and he also treated her like a grown-up. And she tells a story of when she was a little girl sitting on her grandfather's lap while he was typing sermons, and he would read the sermons to her, and she wouldn't understand half of it, but she would ask him questions, and he would very patiently explain these religious concepts to her. Yeah. And another aspect of it was this concept of fairness and what's fair. She had that instilled in her at a very young age and has carried it throughout her life. She just, I mean, I think in the kinds of sexist issues she ran into in the 1960s and 70s, which she compares to the whole ethos on the program Mad Men, if you've seen that. Mm-hmm. The way she fought against that was by insisting that she be treated fairly.
Right. And then a fairly similar figure when she became a business executive as a teenager in the copper mine. The old copper mine that had been long abandoned as a working mine, but became a museum and run by a visionary who needed somebody who understood how to do business.
Oh yeah, let me tell you about that. Okay, this is in the copper country of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. The heyday of copper mining was long past when she was growing up. So there were a number of abandoned copper mines. There was one practically in her backyard in Hancock, Michigan, in Ripley, Michigan, which is next door to Hancock. And shortly after moving there, I think it was in 1950 or 51, she was 15 years old, and she got a summer job in this little startup enterprise. There was a local well digger named Arvo Walitalo. He was half Finnish, half American Indian, and he had leased an abandoned copper mine, and his idea was to turn it into a tourist attraction. And his first employee was 15-year-old Margaret, and he wanted her to develop a tour of the mine. And she didn't know anything about copper mining, but she talked to mining people at her father's college and got to know what was distinctive about copper mining in the Upper Peninsula and what the life of the miners was like. And she developed a tour. And in short order, this became a popular tourist attraction. I think Arvo was very good at promoting. So he bought billboards on major highways in the area, directing people to the mine. And Margaret would give them a really entertaining tour.
Let me just because we're about halfway through our session here, and I'm going to move things along just a little bit by observing that one of the big things that happened in her teenage business executive career was learning how to hire people and how to lead them.
Yes, yes. Okay, so I told you about the beginning of the copper mine. She worked at this mine for a number of summers, and she developed a gift shop. She did Arvo's bookkeeping. She was like the CEO. She hired her little brother because they needed more tour guides, and she hired other kids. So she was running this big enterprise. She said it was her schooling in management.
Yeah, and that was all before she went to college.
Yes.
And in college, she had some amazing professors. At least you've identified some that were basically they followed right in the footsteps of her father in many ways. And
yeah, Earlham was quite a place, probably still is. It had nationally renowned philosophers, English professors. The woman who became her mentor was in the mathematics department, Florence Long. She really shepherded Margaret through her early mathematical training and determined was the person who, the figure who Margaret aspired after emulating. Margaret really wanted to become a college mathematics professor like Florence Long.
Yeah. And then, of course, in college, there was a fellow named Jim.
Oh, yeah, okay. Margaret was, she was a homecoming queen in high school, in college, and in college, the president of the student council was Jim Hamilton. And they hit it off and got married right after Margaret's graduation. Very romantic. And they both wanted to go to graduate school. Jim wanted to go into chemistry and Margaret wanted to go into mathematics. And they got placement at Brandeis University in Waltham, Massachusetts, and were driving out to our neck of the woods to assume their graduate careers, but one of them needed to work. They talked it over, and Margaret decided that she would be the one to get a job, even though she was pregnant and due to give birth in a few months. So Jim started his graduate program. Margaret got a job. The baby was born. Margaret took off a few months, but then got a babysitter and went back to work. Okay. And can I tell you about her job?
Well, let me move along a little bit here.
Okay.
Anybody who was interested in mathematics in those days would sooner or later meet a computer. And if you're my age, and maybe your age, you remember the LGP30, a very clever, fairly clever typewriter with a punch paper tape input and output. And that was the first thing that you could even call a personal computer. It could sit in somebody's office and be used just by that one person. Every other computer was in a room about the size of this one, and was being used by hundreds, dozens to hundreds of people. So she got that, and then she went into the big league shortly thereafter. Once in Boston, getting involved with something called XD1, X-ray Delta 1, which was the Sage computer.
Right. And then there was the big one at Lincoln Labs doing the military work for air defense.
Right. But I thought Sage was much like that. In any case, the point is...
Oh, yeah, that was Sage. Yes, yes.
She did get into big-time computing for the day. So when she finally gets intrigued by the ad where the MIT Instrumentation Lab would like to have some computer people, there she was with a lot of computers in her background, a lot of leadership experience in her background, and we were all 20-somethings in the lab in those days, in the Apollo days, but we all brought something, and she brought this amazing combination, so it quickly became a very prominent member of the technical staff.
Oh yeah, yeah, you were there for that.
Right, I was there for that, and I wonder we could show the what I'd been doing was I'd been developing the a program which I call the Yule system for obscure reasons, and what it did was it was an assembler program, and it took in source code from the programmers, the engineers, in assembly language, and it produced the object code, the binary code that the computer could use. And I know we've got a picture to show of the famous picture of Margaret and a whole stack of these books. And do you have that marked in your?
Oh, well,
yeah,
okay, it's here. It's the front.
Show it to the cameras here also. That one, yeah. And I should explain that we're looking at about a dozen books, each of which is over 1,000 pages. And my software product prepared those things and printed them out. But each one of those fat books, it's 1,000 pages, is the complete program for one of the two spacecraft. So what she's got there is about 6 different missions worth of programs, all of which she obviously was involved in.
Yeah. Yeah, now let's talk a little bit about the processing power of the AGC. Now correct me, because you're a computer guy. Correct me if I'm wrong. But the memory was pretty much like an attachment you get to a text message this day in terms of the amount of computer code. Mm-hmm. And the processing power is about or less than a toy you get with a Happy Meal at McDonald's.
Yeah, that's people talk about Apple Watches. There's all kinds of things used as a metric for that, and that was true. It did what, about 40,000 instructions per second, and a modern computer will do that about 1 million times that.
Yeah.
Which is just incredible. So it meant that those of us who were programming this thing, a microsecond saved was a microsecond earned, and so that was it was a very tight thing, and so that was a challenge for all of us. But I want to talk a little bit now about the Lauren bug.
Oh yeah. Okay, so I talked about how Margaret was pregnant. Well, her daughter was born around Thanksgiving in 1959. Yeah. And so Margaret, or her name's Lauren. So Lauren grew up kind of with Margaret's career, particularly at the instrumentation lab. And Lauren used to come in with Margaret on weekends and play astronaut while her mother was working. Yeah. And it was while Lauren was playing astronaut on a command module simulator that she hit a particular sequence of keys on the AGC, the Apollo guidance computer, that caused the program that was then running to crash. And Margaret realized that astronauts on the way to the moon, if they had hit the same sequence, would be in big trouble. So she asked her bosses if she could write a few simple lines of code to prevent this from happening. And her bosses said, oh, that would never happen. The astronauts don't make mistakes. Well, wouldn't you know it, when Apollo 8 flew in this was December 1968, this was the first mission to leave Earth and go out to the moon. They didn't land on the moon, but they circled the moon and then came back. It was quite an astonishing mission. But on their way back, they were so tired. It was like day 6 of the mission. They hadn't been getting much sleep. And so Jim Lovell, who was working the navigation computer, hit exactly the sequence of keys that Lauren had hit. And the computer crashed. They lost all their navigation data. The screen went blank. the spacecraft didn't know where it was, and they were hurtling back toward Earth and toward reentry a couple of days later. And Margaret was at the instrumentation lab kind of minding the store and knew exactly what had happened. She said, "It's the Lauren bug." And they had to scramble, the computer engineers had to scramble for hours to make sure no unanticipated problems had come up and to like get the computer back and running.
Yeah. So they had to basically fill in all the, help them restore all the navigational data. So one of the things to be very grateful for, this happened on the three-day trip back from the moon. There was plenty of time to fix all this stuff. Other phases of the mission would not have been so.
Right. Yeah.
So that's a
well, and when the spacecraft landed, they said, "Margaret, could you write those 2 or 3 lines of code that will prevent this from happening again?" Yeah.
So that's yeah, astronauts and such do learn, but it doesn't happen instantaneously.
Right.
Okay, we have only a few minutes. I'd like to talk a little bit about 1202 and 1201 in Apollo 11.
Well, any of you who are, well, I don't know if, well, any of us who are watching or listening to the landing of Apollo 11 on July 20, 1969, may have picked up on like a computer warning in the last minutes of the landing. It was a 1202 I think Buzz Aldrin said 1202 program alarm.
Yeah.
And
right.
back at Mission Control, one of the controllers, you didn't hear this, but one of the controllers said, 1202, what's that?
Yep.
Well, it was what Margaret calls a never supposed to happen computer alarm.
Let me, excuse
okay.
me, well, because we are approaching end of our time, let me just very quickly complete the story, which is that everything that had been programmed into the computer to survive unexpected events worked. Anyhow, all of us Apollo veterans are very used to having to tell that story over again.
It's a good story.
It is an excellent story, and I'd like to just close here by saying that if you've enjoyed this interview and would like to see more, you will find links to them through our website, CapeCodWritersCenter.org, through our Facebook page, and on YouTube. Search for Books and the World and sign up at YouTube for all the coming shows. The interviews are also available via Cape Media Center at www.capemedia.org, Channel 99, Apple TV, and Roku. Thank you for watching Books and the World.